Hi, everyone. This is George Couros, and this is a special edition of the Innovator's Mindset podcast. I was actually reached out by a wonderful person named Bhavna, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly, from India. And she actually is doing a book study with her class. So I wanted to connect with them. It's just the timing didn't work out because of time zones, etc. So I encouraged her to actually reach out and share some questions with me, and I'm going to share some answers because they're reading the Innovator's Mindset. And I thought might as well record this for a podcast so you can kind of learn a little bit about the backstory of the Innovator's Mindset and why I wrote it and what are some things that are applicable today. And what a blessing that schools are still reading this, still connecting with this. It is actually the 10-year anniversary of the book this year. And why I think it's really relevant to this day is because it talks about how do you deal with change. And the thing with change is that is never going away. We're always going to be in a world where it's constant flux, constant change. It's actually the rate of change, how quickly things are happening. So that's something that I really focused on in the book. And I was inspired by the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, because that book, even though it was written in the 1930s, it's still relevant to this day. So how do you write a book that actually talks about change, but could be relevant a decade and hopefully even longer than that as well? So here are the 5 questions they asked me. I want to share the responses with you all as well. Bhavna, thank you so much for inviting me into your class and inviting me into your book study. I hope that I can do this some justice. So here's the first question. So the first question that Bhavna's class asked me is this one. What inspired you to write the Innovator's Mindset, and how did your experiences as an educator shape its core message? Previously to becoming the division principal of innovative teaching and learning in my district, and I write about this in the book, I was a teacher, a vice principal, a principal, and to be honest with you, I was very into technology. Then this opportunity opened up, and we decided to actually call the job title Division Principal of Innovative Teaching and Learning. And the idea of innovation was very new. You could not really find anybody in any school district at the time that had innovation in their title. So part of my role was to really define what did innovation even mean. And the reason I actually mentioned that I was really into technology is because often innovation is seen that if you use technology, you're innovative. And kind of through my exploration, kind of really focusing on new and better teaching practices, what I discovered is that innovation obviously can have technology, but it is really about doing new and better things. How do you actually find different ways you can go into your classroom and create really great learning experiences, even though we're within constraints of the work that we actually do. And I'll give you a really quick example. Let's say that you know all the science of reading, you have all the background, the research, everything that's in your practice, and then you're actually working with a student who, no matter all the years of implementation, all the years of research, all the years of learning whatever you learn, it's just not working with that child. Do we actually ignore that child's needs, or do we actually use our experience, our wisdom, to take some of those lessons that we've learned and maybe iterate them or change them a little bit to really help that child read? And as I defined in the Innovator's Mindset, innovation is either iteration or invention. It can be kind of a modification of something we've done in the past, or it can be something totally new that you've never done before. And so as I go through the practice and as I kind of talk about it, it is really thinking differently about the ways we teach and learn. And it's not ignoring things that have worked in the past. And I think that's a really important component. It is actually saying what is working and what's not. And if something's not working, how do we actually have the agency ourselves to find new and better solutions in the practice, within our classrooms? And I think also really thinking about differently about leadership, how we connect with people. How do we actually, have staff professional learning or staff PD days that emulate what we want to see in the classroom? If you are in administration and you're asking people to do things very differently, but your practice, your cadence of what you do in your schools looks exactly the same as it did 10, 15, 20 years ago, but maybe with some digital components, it doesn't really help people to experience something that's new and better. So I think that was really kind of my experience, is really kind of what does innovation actually mean? How did I actually implement it in my own practice? And really looking for those new and better ways. And I think that to me is really, really what matters, is how we actually think differently about the practice and have that agency to create our own solutions moving forward. And again, I think I really want to emphasize, it doesn't mean getting rid of traditional practices. It's just ensuring that the practices we're using are working. And if they don't, do we actually try to figure out something, a little bit different? Maybe it's a tweak, maybe it's something totally new to ensure that we are helping the people that we serve right in front of us. So the second question is this. You emphasize empowering learning and unleashing talent. What are some practical ways teachers can begin fostering this mindset in traditional classroom settings? It is really important to me to identify that in your classrooms, there are certain things that you are constrained by, which is why I did the follow-up book, Innovate Outside the Box, with my good friend, Dr. Katie Novak. We're always going to have constraints. There's certain curriculum we have to follow. There's standardized testing. And I think it's really easy to say to people that you do not, don't worry about it. Just, we need to tear down the system, et cetera. And I do think we have to change things the way that we're doing school, but that doesn't really help people to say, hey, ignore your job responsibilities and then try to do these different things, because if they don't do their job responsibilities, they're not going to actually have a job. So I think it's really kind of working backwards from our students and understanding, we still have curriculums, we still have constraints within our schools. And there's one example I share often. There is it's an older video. It's called Google Apps in Plain English. And it actually showed a teacher, or actually showed someone explaining what Google Apps is. And Google Apps have been around forever, so that's not the point of this conversation. But it did something to explain called paper slides. And it actually showed these slides, and you could see the person explaining it doing a voiceover and explaining that concept. And what was interesting is that one of our students saw that process and said, that's a really great way to explain a topic. So they actually went and they did, for pitch, roll, and yaw in the curriculum, it was grade 6 science curriculum, and they actually did pitch, roll, and yaw, and they explained this to the entire world. And I love sharing this example because I explicitly say, hey, this was in the curriculum, and they still were able to explain it. And in fact, they know it way better because they had to teach it to the entire world. I think it's really kind of finding some of those opportunities to really get kids to explain things in a different way, because that young lady was fine on any test on that topic because she actually had to teach it to the entire world. And I think with all the technologies, all the access that we have, are there different ways that we can really emphasize our students sharing their learning in multiple ways that make sense to them? One of the things that I've always struggled with is that, are we actually, for example, grading our students on their understanding of science or their ability to write about their understanding of science, which are two different things? So do we give kids different opportunities to share their learning, but still obviously have to deal with the curriculum? And my belief system is that as much as I think school really needs to change in what we look at, how you go about it is you kind of find what are some of the constraints, how do you actually create new and better opportunities, and that innovative practice, eventually, if more and more people start using it, it just becomes best practice. And that's when you start changing the system within and people start emulating some of those opportunities that kids actually have. So I think within a traditional classroom, there are opportunities. Of course, there are some times that we can't do these things all the time, but the more opportunities that we actually really empower our students to share their learning in different ways, I think the more they're comfortable doing some of the compliance stuff as well that we all have to do, not only in school, but in life. So that's how I'd answer that question. The next question is this one. Creativity is a key theme in your book. How can schools shift from compliance-based systems to environments that truly celebrate creativity and innovation? When I first read this question, I was brought back to something my mentor, Kelly Wilkins, had said to me that really made me think differently about practice. She said, the way that you assess drives your teaching, not the other way around. So for example, you hear many people complain about teachers teaching to the test, but then my question is, what are you celebrating? And often what happens is schools will say, oh, teachers, they're teaching to the test, but then all they will share is their test scores. And so if you share your test scores all the time, then people are going to focus on teaching to the test because that is what you're celebrating. So I think the big shift in my focus is, as you're looking at that, when you're talking about celebrating creativity and innovation, one of the things that I think would be really, really powerful is thinking differently about how we share with our communities some of the things that we're actually doing that go beyond test scores and actually are a little bit deeper. So for years, I've been building my own portfolio. And it's weird to say that because I know it's been about 14 or 15 years since I first started my blog/portfolio at georgecouros.com. And the only reason I actually shared this was because I wanted to understand how to do digital portfolios myself, because we were going to teach it to students. And if I was going to be effective, I had to actually go first. So as a principal, I started my own digital portfolio. And what's really interesting about that process is there's really different ways that you can actually share your learning. It can be written, it could be, obviously do podcasts, media, share your learning in different ways. And what's beautiful about this, you can actually share it with your communities and share it in totally different ways. One of the things that really has helped me through this process is you look at, for example, more and more students in our world, if not all of them, and in fact, probably all of them that are in schools right now will be at minimum Google for a job or a college or a university type opportunity. And when I say at minimum, one of the things that's actually shifting is more and more places are finding people not through traditional searches. And it's weird saying traditional Google searches because like it's only been around for a little while, but they're finding people through like AI. And you're seeing, for example, SEO transition to what's called AEO, right? Answer engine optimization. So the more students share their expertise, share the things that they're actually learning. What's really interesting is me talking about some of these stuff, answering these questions, even though it's in a media production, it is actually going to help me be found in not only a Google search, but also like a ChatGPT search or any other, AI driven search through that process. And so I think that's something that we have to kind of start aligning, that there's different ways to share this. And if a student really loves to write, they have that opportunity. If they want to make video, they have that opportunity. But are we highlighting those things? Are we sharing some of those things? Are we just showing students as numbers? One of the concepts I talked about in both Innovator's Mindset and Innovate Inside the Box is the idea of actually being learner-driven, evidence-informed practice, that we're not data-driven. We're driven by the students in front of us. But the terminology evidence-informed was to say there's different ways we can share evidence of learning. So for example, it can be tests, it can be scores, but it's also videos. It's also conversations that we have. And I think that helps us to really kind of show different ways that our students can learn and highlight those things. So if all you talk about is test scores, then people are going to teach the test. But if there's different ways you can share learning within your community, I think that kind of goes away, from that very singular focus of tests. There's different ways that we actually learn. If you judge me by my scores in school, you wouldn't talk to me, but there's different ways I share my learning today. And I think that's what we have to really emphasize with our students as well. Fourth question is this one. What role does failure play in nurturing an innovator's mindset, and how can educators help students and themselves become more comfortable with it? One of the things I've always challenged, I think I really struggle with this, is that we need to embrace failure. And I think that I understand the meaning behind what people are actually saying when they talk about this, but I actually think it's the wrong focus. What we need to embrace and really bring up is the idea of resiliency, not the falling down, but the ability to actually get back up and go through that process. As an educator and someone who speaks at conferences, works with groups all over the world, one of the things that I talk to teachers and administrators about, and I think it's really important, is that if there's anything that I'm struggling with, you're struggling with, that I'm talking about, is there anything that you really need to push your learning? Do you actually model this to your students? Will you go back from today and say, you know what, I heard this person and they really struggle. They really challenged me with some of these things that I haven't done in the past. And here's some things I'm going to talk about or try to learn because of that conference. What a lot of people struggle with is the idea that we encourage people to take risks, to do different things, but do they actually see us doing the exact same thing? And I encourage administrators who often talk about, teachers taking risks. Do they actually see you taking risk yourself? And I think really, if we want to kind of start in that space, we have to model that we're willing to try to do different things. And sometimes this is the idea of failure. Things don't actually work, but how do we learn to pivot? How do we actually get back up? And what do we learn from that process? Me doing this right now and modeling to you and trying to do some different things really started with me, doing videos and talking about my learning this way. And I remember the first time I did like a walking video, and I do them, like I do one a week. I try to record it, 100 times over because I was like sweating. I was so nervous about the process. And now I've become more comfortable. And I think that progression of being able to try different things. And each year, I know this is a weird thing, I try to do something different, whether it's learn to play the piano, which I started, I think, when I was 49 years old. I just turned 50. Whether it's, starting this podcast in 2020 before, the pandemic. Modeling that learning and trying different things, it is the ability to, develop resiliency. Failure is just part of the process, but the most important part is the ability to get back up. Do we talk about when things go wrong and what we did to correct them? I think if you want students to do that, they have to see you doing it first, because a lot of times you just think you just know everything, but they don't see how you got to that place. Showing the messiness of learning is really crucial to actually embracing that resiliency. So the last question is this one. In today's rapidly changing world, how can school leaders cultivate a culture where both teachers and students continuously adapt, grow, and lead with purpose? I think when we talk about leaders getting people to do something for others, we always have to say, what are we modeling ourselves? How do you actually see that we are trying something different? As I mentioned in the last question, we often encourage people to take risks, but they don't necessarily see them ourselves. So that was something I really focus on, is like, what are you modeling? What do people see? How do they see you taking risks, trying new different things? If you want people to change their practice, they actually have to see that you're willing to do something first. The other part of this too is that there's kind of this divide, and it's always been in education, where you have people who are really excited to try new things, really out in the forefront. And then you have people who are really believe in the importance of like traditional schooling. And it's almost like they're on two sides of this. One of the things that I have really focused on is, how do you actually bring these people together and move them forward in that path, that we don't discount the traditional practice that have worked forever. One of the things that I'm really focused on is we talk about the aspirational aspects of education. We talk about innovation all the time. I've done this forever, but what I need to get better at is really talking about the foundational elements. So for example, we want kids to be able to write books, to share their learning with the world, but to be able to do that, you have to learn to read and write. And so I think when you emphasize the foundational and then talk about how you can build on the aspirational, that's where things go really, really well. Too often in education, we share these really aspirational things, but then we get back into the conversations. And there was a speaker I heard about a year ago, and they said something that really struck me, that we need to de-emphasize memorization. And all these people started cheering. It was a tech conference. Of course they're going to cheer, because you can find all the information yourself. Why would you need to memorize stuff? So the idea of de-emphasizing memorization, what that's going to do is going to create that divide. People say, no, you actually should memorize things. You shouldn't have to, look up everything on your phone. And then you're going to have people talking about like, oh, you can have access to all the information in the world. So it creates a divide. So what I really focused on the last several years is that what we need to do in schools is to actually develop a deep understanding of information, that we actually really focus on deep learning. And by default, what you have done is memorize it. If you understand something deeply and you can make your own personal connections to those ideas, you'll by default memorize that. And why I make that statement, I think that is something that really, really matters, is because you're not pushing people aside that really think memorization is important. In fact, they'll probably actually say, yeah, we should actually develop deeper learning, but you're not, ostracizing them. But you're also emphasizing to the people that are really trying new things that kids actually have to know basic stuff. They should know basic fundamental facts that we can build upon. I think those two things push each other, but it helps people to move forward. The other response to this question that first came to my mind was, we want to create these cultures, but when we do this, do we focus on what people are really good at and what they're strong at and really bring out the best in the people that we actually serve? Or do we just constantly focus on what's not working, what we should be doing better? As someone who's really, avidly into sports, one of the things that I notice the best coaches do is they don't try to make every player the same, but they ensure that every player has a role to make the team better. And there's certain elements that if that person doesn't contribute the thing that they're really great at, it doesn't necessarily help the rest of the team. But you can't have everyone being good at the exact same thing. The same is true in education. Do we focus on what people are really good at and help them bring that out to the forefront and build upon it? And I believe this, that everything you want happen in your school, it already exists. It's just your ability to bring it out to the world, and to bring it to the forefront. That's what we need to do. We have all the things that we need to do in school, but how do you bring it to the forefront? I think it's really ensuring people feel valued and that we're tapping into their passions and strengths, which ultimately, if you have that confidence, if you develop confidence, you will develop your weaknesses as well. So for me, when we're talking about administrators, talk about leaders, first of all, we have to focus on what are we doing to grow ourselves and to really develop, but also how are we bringing out the best in the people and really helping them bring out their gifts to the world. And that helps us to not only be the best in our school, but also we respect each other. We have an appreciation for the gifts that are there as well. So I think that's where it starts. Anyways, that's how I want to share some questions with you. Thank you so much for reading the book. Thanks for all the other people who are not reading the book. Check it out. I'm very proud of it. I hope it still pushes your thinking to this day. I'd love to hear from you as well. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for reading the book. Have a wonderful day. Take care.